Thank you very much, Vardakis, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here, Kent and Marie. It's been fantastic. So today I'm going to be talking about a general consolidated pipeline that we've developed for the study of Alzheimer's disease and its trajectory, specifically from mild cognitive impairment to fully defined AD. So I'm a postdoc working within the Fluidics and Biocomplexity group under the supervision of Vardakis at UCL. So the vast bulk of this work took place within the VIII PhD project, which was a large EU project with around 85 partners, with two major pillars, if you like, a biomechanistic theme through the mechanistic modeling on the left and the phenomenological modeling on the right, which were closely intertwined when it came to developing various hypotheses and parameters and optimizing those, underpinned by a lot of data, as you would expect, which, when everything worked in tandem, would provide some interesting biomarkers that could be incorporated in a clinical decision support platform that was developed as part of the output of the project. And you can read more about that in a recent publication that just got accepted. So when defining the models that we've used throughout the years, this has been a long-standing effort. It's taken around 10 years from the time I was a PhD student. We started developing simplified models to look at hydrocephalus, and we've slowly and surely extended those both in complexity and I would say in intricacy over the years to be able to account for essentially the perfused parenchymal tissue in 3 dimensions. So obviously one of the drivers is to be able to cover the multi-scale characteristics of the cerebral environment, which was obviously a guiding principle of ours over the years. So I'm not going to go into too many details regarding Alzheimer's disease. This was touched upon yesterday. I'm just going to say that it's defined obviously by microscopic characteristics, and essentially macroscopic alterations are also visible in the form of atrophy, ventriculomegaly, cortical thinning, and obviously white matter abnormalities. So one of the key underpinning aims of this VPH project was to be able to use biomechanistic modeling and somehow quantify the influence of lifestyle environmental factors such as smoking and pollution. These were not the focus lifestyle environmental factors of the work that I'm going to present, but you could imagine this was quite a popular theme a few years ago, so it inspired us to essentially quantify, an attempt to quantify lifestyle environmental factors within a broader framework. So the only reason I've incorporated this slide is to note that over the years we've essentially kept true to some of the principles of the underlying classical hypothesis of CSF transport to again guide us in the model development, but we're also flexible in our current position in the sense that we can test different hypotheses allied to CSF transport. So of course the clinical perspective is it's important to obviously be able to account for the lifestyle, environmental and modifiable factors as a manifestation of progression of Alzheimer's disease. And some interesting ones that we did incorporate in our studies in the project were smoking, obesity, pollution, and sleep, and obviously some of the protective mechanisms associated with exercise, sleep, diet, and socializing. So the main focus for us was identifying the mechanisms through which this interplay could occur and attempt to push back the diagnosis back in 2013, which was around 20 months to around 12. So the way that we tried to do this initially was to try and move away from the amyloid hypothesis, which is prevalent and continues to be prevalent, and touch upon the vascular hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. So instead of the the typically defined amyloid beta deposition turning into senile plaques and subsequently offering neurodegeneration and therefore Alzheimer's disease. We tried to look at the vascular hypothesis because they strongly incorporate the sense of lifestyle environmental factors determining the progression of the disease. So this was the main driving point behind why we chose to look at the vascular hypothesis as opposed to the amyloid hypothesis for the remainder of the project, which was around 2015 to 2017. So the core principles surrounding the mathematical models, I'm not going to go through any of the mathematical details for the purposes of brevity, but essentially it's underpinned by multiple network poroelastic theory. So you could imagine a sponge where there is a solid matrix and that sponge is perforated by pores and fissures of varying porosity and permeability. And one of the hallmarks of the method that we use is we can have different fluid phases within the solid matrix, and they can communicate with each other freely, however not violating any continuity within the system. So again, some of the more mathematical assumptions associated with MPET, which I'll refer to from now, can be found on the right-hand side, but for the purposes of brevity, I'm just going to continue. So essentially what we have is a set of equations, of partial differential equations, conservation of mass and momentum, equations that are essentially solved at each node of a tetrahedral element that is essentially a discretization, a mesh of the parenchymal volume. So I'm going to show you in subsequent slides how we essentially obtain these volumes from the structural images, but I'm just going to say that for the purposes of the physiology under consideration, we deemed appropriate a number of 4 networks for our poroelastic model. So we have 4 fluid phases, 3 associated with the blood networks, arterial, arterial capillary, and the venous blood, and an amalgamated CSF-ISF space. And we've used this quite successfully for various applications over the years, and some of the literature can be found again on the right-hand side. So we looked at aspects of hydrocephalus, alleviating the symptoms of acute hydrocephalus through 3rd and 4th ventriculostomy. We looked at simplified models for edema formation, not stratifying different types of edema, just a generic qualitative understanding of edema through these models, and more mathematically advanced models of the same system. So in order for us to be able to conduct a study that was scalable for the purposes of this modeling effort, we developed as part of the project the prospective data collection program, which incorporated our partners in Venice. And this essentially meant that we had data for around 104 subjects, evenly split between controls and MCI. And the type of data that we collected were T1-weighted MR images, some diffusion weighted MR images as well, which I'm going to go into more detail in the subsequent slides, in addition to the more intricate details that we required to be able to form an argument surrounding lifestyle and environmental factors. So Holter recordings, cardiac and carotid ultrasound, actigraph measurements, and a lot of patient specificity through lifestyle questionnaires. And what did we do with this data? So what I just described in the previous slide is essentially one component of the consolidated pipeline. I'm going to go through the driving component right now, which was the imaging pipeline, and then get onto the data sets. So essentially, to be able to get our final meshes that we could use for the modeling, which were in the form of a parenchymal surface, adequately resolved for the purposes of our study, in our opinion, and a cerebroventricular representation, trying not to be harsh on the segmentation, of course, of both surfaces, and a novel form of a permeability tensor map, which allowed us to differentiate between white and gray matter in a little bit more detail because there are limitations with our modeling, which I'm going to go into at the end of the presentation. But essentially, it's the participation of the structural MR and diffusion MR images through a very straightforward series of events, which ultimately gives rise to a mesh and a permeability tensor map. And I will add that this is a high throughput pipeline, so we could get from essentially the imaging sets to the final meshes and permeability tensor maps in around 40 minutes, which was quite good, considering we had 104 data sets. The second important component of this consolidated pipeline is essentially taking into account all those lifestyle and environmental factor parts of the data and being able to calibrate an output from that feeds into our own poroelastic model in the form of boundary conditions that have to do with cerebral blood flow. So the main driver in our poroelastic model is this arterial blood compartment. So what we try to do is personalize this compartment as much as possible through the use of a combination of lump parameter circulation models, surrogate models, and cerebral autoregulation models, which could essentially take spot measurements of data of interest and convert those to continuous waveforms. And these cerebral blood flow waveforms were calibrated with respect to the demographics and the specific patient data associated with that subject. So we can get a nice personalized representation of lifestyle environmental factors that could feed in as a boundary condition to a continuum model. So this was the first step. The second stage of personalization was the permeability tensor map, which I mentioned earlier. That helps to personalize the CSF-ISF compartment. And for the remaining two compartments, we essentially use values from the literature to guide us in our modeling principles. So the outputs of this waveform in the lower left-hand side essentially come in the form of 4 cerebral blood flow profiles partitioned in the left and right hemispheres of the brain, in the ICA and the vertebral arteries. And the way that we would apply these waveforms on the parenchymal surface is we would segment the parenchymal surface into 4 partitions and apply different waveforms with respect to the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery, either to the cerebrum or the cerebellum over the hemispheres. And this would be in the form of a flux boundary condition. So when all the ingredients of the pipeline are put together, we have essentially our poroelastic model, which is personalized through the high throughput imaging pipeline and this lump parameter circulation model pipeline that provides us with boundary conditions. So when all of that is running together, we essentially get results or solution fields that look like this, which are quite rich and diverse, although mainly qualitative in nature for things that interest us right now. They do portray a lot of prospect in essentially validating this model in the future. So we verified the model with industrial standards with respect to poroelasticity, but now we're in the process of validating the model as well through essentially a comparison between our outputs and ASL images. So this is the latest development surrounding the validation. But the types of data that one can get that are of interest are, for instance, clearance. We can get perfusion. We can get ICP. We can get this interesting representation of swelling in the parenchymal tissue, which is essentially edema if it's positive. It's a swelling, sorry, if it's positive. It's a drainage of the parenchymal tissue if it's negative. And we can also get interesting parallels to make. For instance, we can identify areas of high drainage and high ICP simultaneously, and therefore make parallels to extravasation theory if there's a breakdown in the ependymal wall. So we can make such qualitative descriptions. I mean, one can see the periventricular lucency when we're considering a swelling characteristic of the parenchymal tissue. And then we can also become a little bit more localized with respect to regions. So these are generic axial and coronal slices through two subjects, one control, one MCI, and these are essentially at the level of the hippocampus. So we can get similar types of results at different regions of the brain, create a database out of all of our results, which is useful because then we can actually conduct some statistical analyses that are of more relevant interest, I think, in the longer term. So we've analyzed our data sets and our perfusion data sets, eliminating any invariant confounders in the data. We can get some interesting statistically significant results when we stratify with respect to gender and disease state between the groups, and we can also move a little bit further in areas of interest. For instance, we can look at the cortical gray matter, isolate it from regions of interest like the hippocampus, and then stratify again our statistics with respect to hemisphere, left or right, disease state, and activity level, which utilizes environmental and lifestyle factors quite naturally. So what we tried to do in this data set was to look at the subject and look at the areas of highest activity during a 24-hour period and lowest activity during a 24-hour period, signifying exercise and sleep. And we tried to look at the details as much as possible. So we have at our disposal 28 different regions of the parenchyma, and here I'm going to show you just the cortical gray matter and the hippocampus in the subsequent slide. So we can get interesting statistics when we stratify with respect to hemisphere, right or left, and with respect to gender, disease state, and activity level. And this is for the clearance mechanism in the parenchyma. We also have the ability to look at periarterial and perivenous swelling, because these are natural outputs of the poroelastic system, and again, conduct a similar analysis to the stratified statistics. And as I mentioned, we can also look at more interesting regions for us in Alzheimer's disease, such as the hippocampus, the amygdala, the brainstem, in a lot of detail at this point in time. So where we're going with this work is quite multifaceted at this point. We've extended the model formally from 4 to 6 compartments to garner better insight from the glymphatic system, again, mainly from a qualitative point of view at this point in time. We're also conducting some interesting CFD studies that utilize the results that we get from our poroelastic solver and coupling fluid mechanics and solid mechanics essentially in a very interesting way, and making some assertions on the influence of the choroid plexus. Calibrating our model in more detail for certain compartments, and something which is, I think, developing quite nicely is the concept of remodeling. So if one wanted to study, for instance, the clinical question that hypertension may itself result in hyperperfusion through remodeling of small blood vessels and white matter alterations, we would need a remodeling approach to this type of problem. And we've already conducted some pilot studies, which we've extended now to around 30 subjects at this point in time. So manuscript pending for that one. I would like to thank my collaborators through the VPH project over the years, and of course the head of our lab, Yannis Vardakis, and my colleague Li Weigua. That's all from me. Thank you.
Any questions for John?
Hi, John. Thanks for that. It was nice to see all that put together. It's a really beautifully sophisticated model. I'm just
you.
wondering what your approach has been to the problem that we all face in modelling this, which is parameter identification. I guess it's magnified because you've got so many different compartments with so many different parameters. How do you get those, and how do you define those parameters and check them?
So at this point in time, what we've tried to do is take it step by step. So we've tried to calibrate two compartments which are of most interest to us for the broader spectrum of results that we could apply, the arterial and the CSF-ISF compartment, but not to the adequate detail I think that is required for validating clinical data sets at this point in time. So what we're trying to do is essentially correlate our perfusion results with some ASL outputs that we've received from colleagues in Beijing at this point in time, because they're using their own high throughput imaging pipelines for their own work, and we're trying to essentially calibrate our models through the broadest possible available data sets that we have. So that's going okay. It's still work in progress. We have around 27 parameters that we would need to essentially calibrate to clinical standards. I would say at this point around a third are adequately characterized. We still have a long way to go on that front. So a lot of work in progress, but I think we're in the right direction, and I think we're gathering momentum at this point in time.
During the presentation, you show a map, and this map was a cartography of ICP. It is really intracranial pressure. We can produce with your model an ICP map.
Yeah, so right now what we've done is apply boundary conditions that are from the literature on the cortical surface and on the ventricular surface. So the two surfaces essentially that obtain the boundary conditions are this surface and the parenchymal surface. So we've applied values from the literature for the work that's shown here. So the ICP map that you see is based on constants at this point in time, one on the parenchymal surface and one on the ventricular surface. And the goal is, in our future study, which we've already started to conduct, is firstly to calibrate the CSF compartment with respect to infusion curves, and then use clinically relevant ICP values, which we can obtain, I think, in a quite straightforward way and apply them in the model. So our main concern for the modeling at this point was to get the gradients, the transmantle pressure gradients, to adequate levels, considering we use more than one compartment. And they all have to converge within the same simulation time. So it was more of a numerical problem, but we don't foresee any issues on that front.
Yeah, sort of the same question. So you have the input flow from the blood vessels, the major blood vessels, and is the phase shift between them, is that what is translated into the transmantle pressure, or what is it that?
No, at this point, the pressure gradient is purely dictated by two Dirichlet boundary conditions, one on the ventricular surface, one on the parenchymal surface. So the pressure gradient is influenced by other compartments in the MPED system, but considering we scale the different compartments appropriately, the effects are quite minimal. But in the new study that we've conducted now for the validation of the capillary compartment, we've altered quite a bit in the model. So we're using different mechanical parameters, different transfer coefficients, quite a few different boundary conditions, and the scaling has altered quite significantly. So the transmantle pressure gradient there is more representative of any phase shifts that you would get from the boundary conditions in the arterial compartment.
No more questions?
I guess following up on that, you just indicated that you've changed a lot of the parameters to better validate one compartment.
Yeah.
Have you actually looked at how sensitive your distributions are to the range of realistic values for all of those parameters?
We haven't conducted a formal sensitivity analysis. Essentially what we've done in the stages that I'm going to outline is we've verified the model through essentially 1D principles, 2D principles, and then getting a 3D principle that we could verify, namely the infusion curve. So that would be the first step. So we're trying to adapt the parameters because there's just too many. A predecessor of mine, using a one-dimensional model, conducted a formal sensitivity analysis, but one can imagine that the dynamics change quite a bit, considering we are at this point mixing and matching literature values and some personalization. So we have to be quite careful on the variability front. So we're not trying to change too much in the steps that we're taking. We're trying to be very incremental. I can tell you which parameters are going to have the most influence. We've conducted a sensitivity analysis on that front, but they are not of any physiological relevance at this point in time. They're mainly numerical that affect the convergence. And yeah.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.